Hello, I'm David Pendergrass, the pastor of discipleship here at First Methodist West Chase. I'm so glad you're taking the time to watch this video. I hope it will encourage you and equip you for the week's lesson to come. Now, right at the beginning, I want to remind you of the previous chapters, and I hope you will do this through your D group each week as well. Don't forget that we're here in our D group because the vision of discipleship is to grow in mind, heart, and body. That's why we're here. We're here in the D group because we are trying to be disciples, and disciples are growing in our mind, heart, and body. And you might want to spend a few minutes to talk about what that means each group time. I hope you at least will use that vocabulary every single time you meet to remind people that's why we're here. We're growing as disciples. Secondly, remind them what we've covered so far. We're studying how to read the Bible for all it's worth. This is especially true if someone's new to your D group. Please do your best to help them feel right at home. Make sure when they show up, you hand them an outline, you hand them a cup of coffee, whatever it is to say, we're right on page this, turn here, and we're ready to go. And just make them feel welcome as soon as possible. And one way to do that is to do a quick up to speed. Don't forget, we're talking about how to read the Bible for all it's worth. We've just covered how important it is to talk about the historical context, that's exegesis, and apply it to today, hermeneutics. We also talked about last week what is in the process of translation and how important it is to have a good translation when you are studying the Bible. And encourage your people to look back on last week's notes over time. Encourage your people to use this handbook in the future when they're studying a text, whether it be Psalms or Gospel, whatever, that they go back and look back over this notebook. Also encourage them to use the section that says My Notes. That page is at the end of every single chapter. Maybe there's a few minutes before you begin where you reflect on your notes and say, last week, what did you find very helpful or confusing? And maybe you can talk about that as well. But I hope overall that this has been fruitful for you so far. This week we're going to start something a little different. We're going to get deep down into the genres or literary types of the Bible. And the first one up is chapter 5. Chapter 5, Old Testament narratives, their proper use. Now, obviously, I'm not going to read through every word. I want to hit a few highlights. The first thing is bullet point number 1. Biblical narratives are stories, and most of the Bible is composed of stories. Most of it is, and that's good news, which means when you're able to master how to read stories, you'll be really good at reading most of the Bible. And most of us know what stories are. We get it. We know there are characters, there's tension, there's conflict, there's resolution, and that's usually how stories work in any literature. The first point here is really important, and that is biblical narratives are stories not like news reports. They're much more like a family anecdote or family story that's passed on through the generations. It's not to say it's not historical. It's to say that's not the point of the story. And sometimes historical details might be mixed up a little bit over time as oral tradition goes on. But instead of reading the Bible as if every single story or narrative is supposed to be like a newspaper article, that's a different genre. Biblical narrative is not intended for that. Rather, it's intended to give meaning or direction for the audience. Much like you might hear your kids ask you, Mom or Dad, why do we do this? And the mom or dad says, well, it all started when I was a kid and so forth. Or your grandparents years ago used to do blank. And so they tell a story, but the story is answering a question or the story is trying to teach the kids where they came from or why they do a certain thing. Sometimes there's a moral to the story, but usually that's not what's going on in a biblical narrative. And I'll get to that more in a second. But the first thing is that most of the Bible's biblical narrative, and most narratives are stories that give meaning or purpose for the current audience of when that text was written. The second point is this. I want you to help your people see that whenever you read anything in the Bible, there are 3 layers of narrative. There's the broad narrative of the Bible. That's the Old and New Testament combined. That's creation and sin and redemption through the covenants and then the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And then even the final, within the birth of the church, and then the final consummation at the end of time. There's a broad narrative. Then there's the second layer of narrative, like a funnel. You're getting a little bit more narrow. And that's the narrative level of that particular testament. Now, testament is from the Latin word testamentum, and it just means contract or covenant. So there's the Old Testament and that narrative level, and then there's the New Testament and that narrative level. So you might ask, what's going on in the book of Galatians, as in the New Testament, as it relates to the New Testament? Or what's going on in Joshua as it relates to the Old Testament at large? What's going on in Israel at this time of life? Then there's the third layer, the smaller layer of narrative, and that is what's going on in the immediate context. The immediate. So if you talk about Joseph in Genesis, what happened right before Joseph's story, during, and right after it? Those are three layers, broad, and then one of the testaments, and then the specific story of the narrative. Good interpreters keep those three layers in mind all the time. Good interpreters do that, and we want to be really good interpreters. If you look on the bottom of page 13, a few highlights I'm going to hit. I hope you'll read these carefully. Narratives are not allegories. Every event, every character doesn't represent something else. They're not allegories. They meant something to the first people. They were applicable right then. So when God inspired the original authors to write to the ancient Israelites, it meant something to them. It wasn't a secret code waiting for the year 2000 for Hal Lindsey to tell us what it really means. It really meant something to them back then. So I encourage you not to read narratives like allegories. Secondly, narratives are not intended to be short moral lessons. Now, this one's hard for us to hear because Jews did not write narratives for that purpose, but yet most people today use narratives as a way to show a moral instruction. If you look on page 14, I have this tip. By far the most common expression one hears in church after one reads a narrative is, so the moral of the story is, unfortunately, this is a bad misunderstanding of what a narrative is. Now, remember, we're talking about genre, literary type. We don't want to read a cookbook like we read a Stephen King novel. We don't want to read a love poem like we might read a newspaper editorial. They're different genres. And to know the genre, the literary type, helps us know how to apply them. And I'm suggesting to you that the biblical narrative is a particular genre, and it's not to be read like a moral lesson. It's not to be read like a moral lesson. So most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, you don't want to ask the question, what's the moral of the story? Instead, what you do ask, and I say this on page 14 at the top, under tip, rather one should ask this all the time. What does this narrative teach me about God? What does this narrative teach me about God? What does this narrative tell me about the history and development of Israel and the covenant? Third, how does this small narrative fit into the greater narrative of the Bible? Now, don't be discouraged if the answers to those questions tend to be the same thing for different stories. That's okay. This story tells me that God is faithful and He brings His people out of the Exodus. Through the Exodus, He brings them out of Egypt, and He can be trusted and He's powerful and mighty. This story tells me some of the same thing. God can be trusted, He can be faithful, He brings people out of the wilderness, and on and on. That's okay. It's just the same story with the same emphasis, and that's okay. So try not to make the different stories have a different theological point every single time just because we might get bored of the same point. Let the Bible speak for itself. And I encourage you not to have stories have the moral of the story every single time, because that's not the best way to use a biblical narrative. Number 3, narratives are not written specifically about you and not about me. That's important to understand, because God might give a promise to someone in the Old Testament 3,000, 3,500 years ago. It doesn't mean it's a promise to you. It doesn't mean it's a promise to me. And I love how they say it in the middle of my page 14. We can never assume that God expects you to do exactly the same thing that the Bible characters did or have the same things happened to them. So there's no reason to assume just because it happened to them, it will happen to you. Or because that's the way they did it, we have to do it that way too. Now there are many reasons for thinking that. One is because biblical narratives are not meant for that function, not in Jewish history and theology. Secondly, because biblical characters are human and they're flawed. They're not the main character. I'll talk about that in a second. But rather, here's for example, middle page 14. For example, God inspired Moses to go to rescue the Jews from Egypt. We should not apply this, that's hermeneutics. We should not apply it by saying that God always inspires us to do really big things that people will oppose. You will have your Pharaoh in life. Everybody's got a Pharaoh. Everybody's got a huge task that only God can rescue them from. That is not the way to use the Old Testament narratives. There's no reason to say such a thing. There are billions of people around the world who will never do any big thing like rescue Israelites from Egypt. And God still loves them and uses them in their own particular way. Instead, God chooses to give us the moral of the story by using different genres, different styles like law or the teachings of Jesus. That's how we learn our moral instruction. Let me say a few quick things about Hebrew narrative. Again, I hope you will go over these carefully, but things like point of view, just pay close attention to the text. And while I'm talking about point of view, if you'll look at the tip on the bottom of 14, this one is really important, and I hope you'll help your people understand this as well. It's incredibly popular in churches, I've heard it all my life, to ask the question, well, rather to take the mode of, what do you think so-and-so felt, so-and-so thought, so-and-so felt in the story. You just kind of, you take on the, you get in their shoes for a second. Sometimes that makes some creative discussion. The problem is it's a huge distortion of the text. For example, what do you think Joseph's wife was feeling or thinking at this moment? How do you think Bathsheba felt when David raped her? Imagine what Mary must have felt when the angel came to her. This is pure speculation. That's all it is. It's pure guesswork. And I highly discourage this. If God wanted you and I to know what they felt and thought, we would know about it because it'd be in the text. And oftentimes, in fact, almost every time I've ever heard that done, and it's in almost every small group, many sermons of all my life, it greatly distorts the point the text was trying to make. So I encourage you not to do that at all. Instead of what they must have felt like, instead just focus on the text and let the text be enough. Now maybe you really want to know what Mary felt like, and maybe that's really a driving passion in your life because you know someone who's going through a trauma or whatever. Maybe there's legitimate reason behind your wondering. I just want to encourage you to be at peace with not having all your questions answered. The Bible doesn't answer all of our questions because it's not a trillion pages long. But let the narrative speak for itself and not try to read into it something that's not there. Pay attention to the scenes. Pay attention to the characters. And don't forget, characters are all about showing what God is doing in the world. And they're always flawed to some degree. And the tip in the middle of page 15. The chief character in every single scene is God. He is God. So events in the narrative help to demonstrate what God is doing in history and how history is unfolding at God's direction. So, for example, in the Exodus narrative, it demonstrates that Moses holds God's authority, that God is more powerful than the Egyptian gods, and that God rescued his people in order to form a covenant with them. That it's about God and what he's doing to rescue Israel. That's all it's about. The plagues are not meant to give us scientific evidence of how water can turn to blood. It's not meant so we can guess what it must have felt like to have your firstborn killed. It's not to give us an example of leadership in Moses. Most people use this as one of those 3 categories or 4 categories or what they make up other things. But that's not the point of the text at all. Moses is not the point. God is the point. He just chose Moses to be his instrument. So God's presence is always there. It's either implicit or it's explicit. But it's your job and my job as Christian interpreters of the Bible to make certain that God is the central character. So when we read the Old Testament or New Testament narratives, always ask the question, what does this tell me about God? What do I learn about his character? What has God been doing through history? How is God fulfilling his covenant? How is God redeeming people? And that will get you great interpretation of the narrative. Now, one last thing, and that's on page 16, I want to emphasize here. And that's the last little bit here when I have discussion time. Read Genesis 37 if you have time. Pay close attention to all those things we raised before, scene, character, plot, and so forth. Have the people in your D group discuss those issues. Go back and use this vocabulary. What is the plot? Ask them. What are the characters? What does this teach us about God? And so forth. Now, before you're finished in your D group, on the last tip here on page 16, please read aloud the principles for interpreting narratives on page 106. You'll see just a straight list on page 106. I encourage you to have someone or different people to read this list aloud slowly. And if you have any questions about these, revisit the text and discuss them some more. But this is a great synopsis of the interpretive tips of the chapter. But I do encourage you, before the D group's over, make sure they've read that. Encourage your D group members to reread that, at least that list through the week. And take some notes in their notes section. And when they come back next week, you can spend some more time on that if you need to. God bless you. I hope this has been helpful. I hope the Holy Spirit continues to move through your D group in the week ahead. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. Be encouraged. You're doing some great work.